I'd like to begin with Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chowdhury, former Foreign Advisor, Foreign Minister of Bangladesh and Principal Research Fellow, ISAS, NUS. Joining him is Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Dean, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Next is Professor Riaz-ul-Hassan, Director, International Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding, University of South Australia, and Visiting Research Professor, ISAS NUS. And finally, the moderator for this session. Please welcome Mr. James Crabtree, Senior Visiting Fellow, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, and Contributing Editor, The Financial Times, Singapore.
Thank you for coming to this session. As I said, my name is James Crabtree. Until recently, I was the Mumbai Bureau Chief of the Financial Times, and I'm now happily installed at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I will be your chairman for the next hour. I think the last two speeches set up what we're to talk about here very nicely. The geopolitics of South Asia is really the coming debate in Asia. At the moment, many people look to the South China Sea as one of the most important areas of regional potential tension and opportunity. I think increasingly, with the economies of South Asia taking their role as the world's fastest growing, and as the power of Asia increases and spreads outwards from the area around China to the area around India, you will see much more focus on South Asia and the interrelation of the countries in that region. China's rise is a huge push factor to this, India's increasing assertiveness under Mr. Modi, and then the response from the United States as it increases its own presence in Asia, and in particular seeks to build warmer relations with India as a counterbalance to China. Within that, you had any number of issues which were raised in the last two speeches by the ministers, respectively, from Singapore and Sri Lanka, from the common threat of terrorism to what the Sri Lankan minister described as the real opportunity for South Asia for the first time to begin to create its own regional security architecture. So let me say no more than that and hand over to our three speakers who will now give their talks. Would you like to go first, or shall we start with Kishore?
No, I think Ifti was supposed to go.
All right, okay, there we are. We have consensus on stage, so we'll start with Mr. Chowdhury.
Many thanks, Chair. Consensus is not something we always see in South Asia, and this is going to be my point. I used to be a diplomat in my previous avatar. And one of the received wisdoms that I was exposed to was the fact that speech was given to the diplomat to conceal his thoughts. Since then, I've become an academic, and I've learned that thought is given to man, I think, to share. And this is what I wish to do. My thoughts on the geopolitics of South Asia, the given subject. Now, South Asia, this vast landmass, which houses 1/5 of global humanity, the tapestry of varied cultures, is not a coherent entity, neither economically, politically, socially, or strategically. In economic terms, South Asian states do not see one another as partners. Less than 5% of their trade is among themselves. When they formally commit to reduce barriers, for instance, non-trade barriers or NTBs mushroom to impede commerce. Many South Asian countries, my own Bangladesh, for instance, turn to Europe, Japan, or the United States and multilateral financial institutions for resource mobilization for their development. Politically, the poor state of inter-country relations appear to have become, alas, a permanent feature. The two largest among them, India and Pakistan, are locked into a set of perennial disputes. These are not only of irredentist nature, such as Kashmir, Siachen, or Sir Creek, but are spread across a very broad of political and diplomatic issues. There have been glimmers of hope, such as those generated by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Pakistan, but these hopes are very quickly evaporated by subsequent developments, such as Pathankot raid, etc. Only Bangladesh-India relations remained warm. Indeed, they gathered momentum with the land boundary agreement, though the unresolved issue of the distribution of Teesta river waters continued to remain a thorn on the side. Socially, sharp divisions, often conflicting, mark the religious and sectarian differences within the South Asian states, between Hindus and Muslims, Christians and others, Buddhists and Muslims, atheists and non-believers. And within the Islamic fold, because of a variety of reasons, including globalization, the extremist Wahhabi Salafi values of the Islamist caliphate from the Gulf and the Middle East are making inroads into what used to be, at points in time, a tolerant, syncretic, Sufi-oriented version of the faith traditionally practiced and prevalent in South Asia. This is also philosophically and ideologically destabilizing, as the notion of the global ummah, the single Islamic entity, which the fundamentalists espouse, directly challenge the concept of the Westphalian nation state, on whose basis the countries of South Asia, or even of Southeast Asia, are largely based. Also disturbing is the perceptible rise in parts of India of the versions of extreme Hindutva. This has seeds of conflict sown in them. The unsettling behavior pattern of the radical Buddhist monks in the Rakhine state of Myanmar, allegedly often supported by the local authorities, have led to massive discontent among the minority Rohingya Muslims. Apart from causing massive migrations into neighboring South and Southeast Asian countries, this marginalized community provides fertile grounds for extremist recruitment. Strategically of concern to all is the growing nuclear arsenals of both India and Pakistan, each with 100 to 120 warheads. And now these include tactical or theater nuclear weapons of smaller yields, say 1 kiloton, for instance, or half kiloton, which incidentally increases the propensity for use. If you have smaller nuclear weapons, if these weapons are more precise, there would be a tendency for you to strike because you would believe that the collateral damage would be limited, and therefore a nuclear war would be fightable or even winnable. However, there is a kind of deterrence that we are all aware exists, but it reflects some kind of an ugly stability, as if it were, because it has insufficient confidence-building measures. Unlike the Cold War era, what we saw between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, this enhances the danger of falling prey to what is known as the Thucydides trap, when conflicts arise out of distorted perceptions. The Greek historian had famously stated, when Athens grew strong, there was great fear in Sparta. The regional organization SADC, unlike ASEAN, has been notoriously underperforming. Now, there are reasons for this, of course. One must understand that the state system within South Asia is based on the perceived distinctiveness of the countries rather than their commonalities. In other words, what is stressed is how the countries are distinct from one another, particularly from India, rather than the common values they share, because their sovereignty can only be defined and understood in those terms. So, when you stress commonality, there comes an intellectual confusion, so to say. Secondly, the Charter itself, the Article 10, for instance, of SADC prevents discussions on any contentious issues, and all major issues in South Asia are contentious. The preferential trade agreement, which lacked a dispute settlement mechanism, is one of the least ambitious trading arrangements in the world. Small wonder, other smaller sub-regional initiatives like the BBIN, which is Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, or even BCIM, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, are beginning to attract more focus and attention. The prospects of the next SADC summit in Islamabad in November right now appears a tad dicey. But then, just because South Asia lacks coherence, it does not mean it lacks importance as countries individually or collectively. Political and economic First, arena. India is already the fastest growing large economy in the world. It is expanding anywhere between 7 and 7.5%. The Modi government might not have pulled off all the desired reforms, including the GST, but India's global footprint is enlarging. In Pakistan, the government, with Army's help, has made significant forward movement in countering terrorism through the implementation of the National Action Plan. Bangladesh, always a bit of a paradox, despite the spate of targeted terrorism that we've just seen in recent past, has managed to post a remarkable progress in social indices like education, reduction of infant mortality, and empowerment of women in a manner judged better than many neighboring Indian states. We've heard from the Sri Lankan foreign minister a little while ago how the country's, about the country's transition from the violent civil war to a peaceful pluralist development. Second, the demographic dividend that we've also heard of, that the youth bulge implies, has given South Asia an advantage over some other countries. The youth can be potential tools in the march to modernity. But it is also a double-edged sword. As this recent sad events in Dhaka shows, well-heeled youth can also succumb to radicalization, for instance, unless appropriately managed. Thirdly, the huge enlightened diaspora to which many of you belong, of South Asia spread across the world, provide an excellent resource for positive potentials. This conference is about tapping the asset of this diaspora for South Asia's benefit. I had, for instance, been speaking of the possibility of a South Asian Diaspora Development Bank. Funding it is, of course, a challenge. But I have had some conversations with people, and there has been some kind of an idea that this could be funded, for example, by, among others, by contribution from the Zakat fund. And Zakat is the mandatory donation to charity that all Muslims must make wherever they are. So you can imagine the kind of resources that could be built up from such donations from so many, many Muslims living all over the world. Finally, being a seat of ancient culture civilization, South Asia boasts of an immense quantum of non-technological or intellectual resources. There are thought leaders today in governments, legislatures, universities, industry, think tanks, all around the world. And much of the world today marches to tunes first piped in South Asian minds. Microcredit, non-formal education, for instance. So, South Asia might lack coherence, but not clout. Its regionalism may be weak, but it is not weak as a region. In the other sessions today, we heard of the big brotherness of India as the largest country, somewhat impeding this idea of cooperation. But the great challenge then to all our leaderships and the Indian leadership would be to transform this big brother syndrome into elder brother syndrome. History evolves through phases. At this point, we are witnessing certain watershed trends. Brexit implies a resurgence of nativist nationalism against a matrix of a broader identity. The burgeoning tensions in the South China Seas could symbolize the difficulties of grappling with the aspirations of a new rising power against the backdrop of established norms and mores. Problems emanating from the Middle East, from the Caliphate to the horrors of Turkey that we've seen over the last 48 hours, could be part of a 21st century backlash to interminable extra-regional interventionisms. Perhaps all South Asian think tanks could work together to set up some kind of an eminent persons group in order to understand and study these complex phenomena to enable South Asia and also Southeast Asia to navigate through these troubled waters. If a rough sea is to be crossed, waiting at its shores and staring at the waters would not do. South Asia must press into its service the intellectual resources in its possession and in the formulation of such a response to these global phenomena. Too tall an order? Perhaps not. As the English poet, also much admired in South Asia, Robert Browning had said, "Man's reach should exceed his grasp. What else are the heavens for?" I thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chowdhury. A speech packed with insight and also elegant phraseology. I think I'll take away with me that South Asia lacks coherence but not clout, and India should move from being a big brother to an elder brother as two to take out of that. Let me move on to Dean Kishore Mehbubani to continue our discussion.
Thank you very much, James. Like Ifti, my good friend, I too used to be a diplomat. And like him, I'm practicing how to be undiplomatic. But I'm going to actually begin in a very Asian way by, first of all, issuing an apology, which is that if I come across as being too undiplomatic, please forgive me. But I've decided that, in this rather unusual world that we live in, you have to be undiplomatic if you want to try and understand it. Because the key point I need to emphasize is that if you're talking about the geopolitics of the world, which is the subject today, it's important to emphasize that geopolitics is always contextual. It depends on which context you're speaking about. I mean, for example, in the Cold War, life was wonderful. It was white and black. You were either pro-American or pro-Soviet, and everyone lined themselves around that. And as you know, China leaned with United States, India leaned with Soviet Union, and so on and so forth, right? And then we went into a unipolar world, which lasted, I would say, for about 2 decades or so. But now we are clearly moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, and it's into completely uncharted waters. And it's going to be a very complex and difficult game to understand because there are too many moving parts in this multipolar game. But to explain what the options are, I thought one device I would use is to look at the options that the world's, in a sense, biggest emerging power today, which is India, to look at the options that India has in this new geopolitical environment, and in so doing and exploring the options, explain the complexities at the same time. And here, in my view, I say that India has in 3 areas 3 clever choices to make or 3 cunning choices to make. And I'll explain what the clever choice is, what the cunning choice is in each instance. And then you'll see how India decides. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that I speak as a friend of India. I have, like many of you, a PIO card. So I'm not an adversary of India. So what are the choices India has? In today's world, the clever choice, and I can tell you, by the way, this is obviously not a secret, the biggest geopolitical contest in the next 10 years will be between the United States and China. That's a given. It's always between the world's number 1 power and the world's number 1 emerging power, China. So the clever choice that India could make is, of course, to lean and form a kind of implicit alliance with the United States in the same way that actually China formed an alliance with the United States against the Soviet Union. And that will be a very attractive option for India. And I know lots of realist scholars in India advocating it very strongly. And India has seen some of the rewards. You know, the nuclear deal that was signed with President George W. Bush, that was in some ways a result of moving closer to the United States. And that's why Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said, for good reason, President George W. Bush was probably the best friend that India has had. And if India does that, it will be logical. You will get a lot of benefits too. But what's the cunning choice that India can take? The cunning choice that India can take is to play the role of a completely independent third actor. One that doesn't lean either towards United States or lean towards China. And what's the advantage of that? I mean, to explain that option, I say, imagine you're a seesaw with United States sitting on one side of the seesaw, China sitting on the other side of the seesaw, each trying to get the balance in its direction. And India stands in the middle, and where it puts its foot affects the entire balance. So if you play the role of an independent third actor, the leverage you have, the influence you have can be much greater. And it is also a fact that independent actors are often regarded with greater respect than those who are allies or, worst case, lackeys. And, you know, to give you a somewhat undiplomatic example, as you know, Japan is a major ally of the United States, and Japan is not an insignificant country. It has, in nominal terms, the world's third largest economy, although in PPP terms, India now is the world's third largest economy. So you'd assume that in Japan will be treated with great respect, right, as a great power. But I'm sure you've all heard that there was a year when Japan ran for a seat in the UN Security Council against Bangladesh and lost to Bangladesh. And why? Actually, I asked some African ambassadors, why did you not vote for Japan? I said, what's the point of voting for Japan? If I vote for Japan, I'm giving an additional vote to the United States. What's the difference? So that shows that if you are perceived to be too close and too trusting an ally, you don't have the same kind of leverage as you do when you're independent. And let me add a very important caveat here. Some people might be seduced by the idea that if you did have an alliance relationship between India and the United States, this would be an alliance of democracies and the close values will hold them together. Now, one of the oldest lessons of geopolitics is that national interests always trump values. And India, of course, learned that in the Cold War, when even though the fact that Pakistan had a military government, China had a Communist Party government, the United States had no difficulty being close to them during the Cold War. And if I can tell you one story that you should always remember, in 1981, at something called the International Conference in Kampuchea, there was actually a fight between ASEAN and China about whether or not the Khmer Rouge should come back to power in Kampuchea, in Cambodia. And ASEAN countries said, no, you cannot bring back the Khmer Rouge. They are genocidal. But China took the correct position under international law and said, you must allow them to come back, right? And we thought the United States would, of course, support ASEAN because we were supporting human rights and speaking out against genocide. I was there in the room, and I was shocked when the United States supported China over ASEAN, because China was too important a partner for United States then. So values don't matter in geopolitics. It's interests. And so maybe in this context, the cunning choice would be to remain an independent actor. Now let me move quickly into the second set of choices. The second set of choices is which regional organization should India move closer to? The most successful regional organization in the world by far is the European Union. The number 2 regional organization in the world is ASEAN. And of course, everyone will say, of course, you choose the European Union. It's bigger, it's richer, it's got a bigger market. ASEAN is a group of relatively poor countries. Why would you want to bet on ASEAN and not on the European Union? So the clever choice would be to choose the European Union. And it could be a choice. But the cunning choice would be to choose ASEAN. And for a simple reason. If you look forward at what's coming in the 21st century, the European Union represents the past and ASEAN represents the future. And people somewhat, half-jokingly say, if you want to go see a museum, you go to Europe, right? I mean, Europe's becoming a museum full of old people, economy struggling, and it's remarkably incompetent geopolitically. It makes mistakes in handling Syria. It makes mistakes in handling Russia. And as you know now, sadly, it may fall apart because of Brexit. That's why it represents the past. So the cunning choice is to go with ASEAN because, as Minister Vivian Balakrishnan said, by 2050, the estimate is that ASEAN will have the 4th largest economy in the world. And there's a very important additional point that is worth mentioning here. For 1,000 years, Southeast Asia was fundamentally an Indian lake. That's why 9 out of the 10 ASEAN countries have what they call an Indic substratum of culture and not a Chinese substratum of culture. So it's a restoration of an old relationship that was cut off in the colonial era. And that's why it may be a cunning choice, because it's a bet on the future. Now let me come to the last option, which I suspect may be the most difficult one. And this is, of course, and Ifti's remarks touched upon it, as you know, the one big obsession that the West has today is what George W. Bush called the global war on terror. And here too, India will have 2 choices. The clever choice, of course, is to join the global war on terror. And India has been a victim also of jihadist terrorists. And so it would be perfectly understandable if India said, we too have been hurt by this. We want to join the battle, and India may play an active role in this battle. And it's understandable. But what would be the cunning choice in this context? The cunning choice which would gain India a lot of goodwill and long-term dividends, is to try and provide a bridge across what is becoming a huge divide between the West and the Islamic world. And if you look at politicians in America and the way they speak so disrespectfully and disparagingly about the Islamic world, is actually quite shocking. What Donald Trump says, what Newt Gingrich says, shows utter ignorance about the state of the world and is hugely insulting to the 1.4 billion Muslims in the world. And clearly what the world needs is someone to try and build a bridge. And the most logical candidate to do this is India, because India already has the world's second largest Islamic population, and by some estimates by 2050 will have the largest Islamic population of any country in the world. And India, as you know, within its society has shown a remarkable capacity for cultural tolerance and understanding, which very few societies can replicate. So if you're looking for a natural candidate to provide a bridge, it would be India. So you can see, as you look ahead in the future, India has three very good, clever choices: become an ally of the United States, bat on the European Union, join the global war on terror, or to take the three cunning choices to be a completely independent great power, to bet on ASEAN, and to be a bridge between the West and Islam. And the choices it makes will have a huge impact on all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kishore. That was a compelling way to divide some of the issues we need to talk about. Let me hand over to our final panelist, Dr. Riaz Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unlike my two distinguished panelists, I'm not a diplomat. I'm a very boring academic. So, and I have been for 50 years. So the first thing I did was to find out actually what does geopolitics mean. And my understanding is it's an interaction between geography, demography, economics, and politics. And then I began to ask myself, how should I mean, there are two ways to, for academics. You either display how much you know, or you try to hide how little you know. I'm not sure the wisdom of people who put me on this panel with these two distinguished diplomats. But anyway, I'll give it a go anyway. I would like to share, take a historical perspective on the geopolitics. And then I will come back to South Asia. 300 years ago, there was no United States, there was no Canada, there was no Australia, the country that I live now, and there was no New Zealand. And then, of course, all these four countries have their genealogy linked to United Kingdom. Now, I did a little bit research on it. These five countries, the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, together occupy 19% of the land mass of the Earth, 19%. And they have 5.5% of the population. India and China together have 38% of the population and 8% of the land mass. In addition, these 5 countries account for 46 or 48% of total defense spending in the world. India and China together account for 15 or 16%. Now, to me, I think over the last 300 years, the rise of this distortion between demography and geography is one of the fundamental source of tension. And I think it still remains, and it will continue to remain, because you have to just look at the amount of money these 5 countries spend on defending, on basically defense. Now, point I want to make is that demography and geography are the ultimate determinants, are perhaps the most important determinants of human destiny. And I'd like to focus briefly on the emerging trends in the demography. And I'd like to particularly pick on, I was very grateful for both my colleagues here to raise the issue of religious diversity in the presentation. I mean, the signposts of demographic diversity in South Asia are everywhere. Partition of India, ethnic nationalism in India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan, breakup of Pakistan, ethnic and religious conflict in India and Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan, and of course, sectarianism. In other words, the religious diversity, our population diversity, is actually has shaped, and will continue to shape the human landscape, political landscape, and economic landscape of South Asia. Let me just focus on why I think so. According to the recent projections about religious demography in the world by the Pew Research Foundation of Washington, first time in human history, by 2050, there would be as many Muslims as Christians in the world. And if you hang around long enough, in 2070, there'll be more Muslims than Christians. Doesn't mean that the Christians are going to be converting. Christians are basically opting out from religion to no religion. And Islam is increasing not because of conversion, because of the younger age group of Muslim population and higher fertility rate, although it is declining too. Now, one of the very important consequences of that for South Asia will be that Muslim populations in South Asian countries will increase very significantly. Pakistan's population will increase by 2050 by 63%. India's Muslim population will increase by 76%. Bangladesh by 35%, Afghanistan by 130%, and Nepal by 130% as well. I'm not sure why Nepali population, Muslim population is increasing so fast, but that's the projection. Sri Lanka's population will increase about the same rate as Pakistan, a little less than 48%. And overall, the Muslim population in South Asia will increase by 65%. And altogether, there would be 850 million Muslims, and the 1.5 billion Hindus, 850 million Muslims, and then there will be other minority religion, Buddhists, Christians, and Jains and other religious minorities. Now, India, of course, will remain, and I'm going to focus on India. India will remain, of course, the largest Hindu country, with population of about 1.4 billion, I think at that time in 2050. But it will also, as Kishore has mentioned, become the largest Muslim population in the world. And that means that India would have the largest Muslim population in the world. Pakistan would be the second largest, third would be Indonesia, and fifth would be Bangladesh. So South Asia would be home to the largest, the second largest, and the fourth largest population in the world. Now, it's going to have very major consequences. And what I would like to, one of the roles of an academic role, I suppose, is a role of most people who are engaged in advancement of knowledge or learning or research, is to raise embarrassing question in polite company. Now, India will become the largest Muslim country, would have the largest Muslim population, therefore become the largest Muslim country in quotes. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenge for the Indian democracy. Let me just briefly mention about why I think so. Indian Muslims today are least educated, and they have the lowest income than any other group in India. In fact, if we take 1947 as a starting point, everybody, of course, India is improving. India is making enormous strides in economic development. But if we take 1947 as a starting point, Indian Muslims have gone backwards. The common sense and sociological theory both agree that when there is a perception of relative deprivation, there would be problems. Now, and I wanted to pursue this issue. I said, why is it? What is the reason for this? Now, we are doing this research at the institute, at our institute. But I just wanted to share with you a research that I have just concluded. We took all the Indian districts, 650, I think 649 districts in India, in which about 600 districts have a Muslim population. And we constructed a social well-being index of all religious groups in each district. Hindu, upper caste Hindus, other backward caste Hindus, scheduled castes and territories, territories, as well as Muslims and other minorities. The findings was that when we ran a regression of what difference as a proportion of Muslims increase in a district, what are the implications for the social well-being? The findings show that as the proportion of Muslims increase in the districts, and there were 600 districts in which there's a Muslim population, their social well-being declines until they reach the 50%. There are about 19 districts in India. So this particular research would indicate, I think to me, points a very important signals, makes a very important point that India would have to start examining the position of Indian Muslims. The SADC committee, which was established in 2004 by the then Prime Minister, actually did quite extensive research on this issue and came up with the finding that the Muslims throughout India suffer from high feeling of insecurity, discriminatory attitudes, and police and public agents, and discrimination by police and public agencies, housing school, in housings and in job markets, in the job market. And there's an increasing ghettoization of Muslims in Indian cities. I was in Gujarat, the state from where Mr. Modi, which Mr. Modi ruled for many years, in Ahmedabad. And I was surprised how segregated the city has become over the last 20 or 30 years. And it was my first visit because it was very difficult to really get visas to go to India. And I think when I did, it was really quite an interesting experience. Now, India is making enormous strides economically, but one would expect that economic benefits will at least remove some of the economic inequalities. But that is not what is happening. Everybody in India is improving, but the rate of improvement of minorities, the Dalits and the Muslims, is not keeping pace with the rate of improvement of other groups. So basically, the issue is how Indian democracy is going to cope with this increasing inequality in India's minority, the largest minority group. Now, India has done remarkably well in coping with problems raised by linguistic and ethnic diversity. We started out with 14, 15 states, there's 29. Indian Constitution is one of the most enlightened documents in the modern world. And it continuously emphasizes and the Supreme Court of India had continuously passed judgments that India must ensure equality of citizenship, not for majority, but also for minority. Now, what India does need now is to really, India has the capacity. India has actually demonstrated that it has a political and legal infrastructure to deal with the problem of pluralism and inequality and diversity of its population. But it requires collective will. And I think without that collective will, India would face a very serious issue. Because with the largest Muslim population in the world, if the Muslim deprivation leads to social unrest, it will have enormous consequences for the whole of South Asia, and it may, in fact, not only South Asia, but globally. And this is something that I think we should probably pay more attention to, and perhaps more research is needed in order to ensure that this does not happen. Thank you very much.